So you're using Wix and you want to implement a cool skeleton loader like the one you see behind me right now, so that while you're waiting for the data from your repeater to populate, you will show a nice cool animation that doesn't require you to add in a lot of bulky UI elements to your site. Welcome to the Wix Wiz. I'm Eitan, and today we're going to be talking about how to implement something like that using CSS in Wix Studio. If you want to learn how to do all that and more, let's get started. For today's tutorial, I am here in a blank Wix Studio website, and you can see that I've added in just a few elements here. Before we get started, I just want to add a disclaimer that unlike most of the tutorials on this channel, this one is specific to Wix Studio. So if you're in Wix Classic, you're not going to be able to use the global CSS feature that we're going to be using in the final part of this demonstration. Before I talk about this new approach, I first want to demonstrate some of the more traditional approaches to managing data states and loading states. So what essentially am I talking about when I talk about these states? I'm talking about elements that need to process data in order to appear or process data during some point of their lifespan. So for example, what I have here is a repeater, and this repeater is typically going to display data from a data collection, whether through a data set or through code. Another good example would be something like a form where the user needs to input things and then click a button to submit that data, and there's going to be some kind of process where we're not sure what the outcome of that submission is. And in all of these cases, we are typically going to have 3 or 4 different states. One state is the loading state, where we're waiting for the data to come in and to populate whatever UI we have. The second state will be either a success state, where we see that it is successful because the data is there, or we display some kind of success message to the user. And another state, which we hope not to get into, but we might, is an error state where either our form submission wasn't successful or we didn't manage to pull some of the data from our servers. And those are the states that I want to demonstrate here. So in a typical scenario, it might look like, or in a traditional approach, it might look something like what we have here in front of us. So I have a repeater here, and this repeater we're going to populate with some mock data. And what else I have here? I have a loader. Okay, I'm currently using a Lottie embed. I placed the loading state here above the repeater, but sometimes you might want to put them one on top of the other. And under here, I have an error message. And now typically what we would do is we would hide or collapse our repeater. So if you haven't opened up code mode yet, then you're going to want to do that over here on the left. You can just open that up and turn on code mode. I already have it on here. And once you've turned on code mode, you should have access to this properties panel right over here. And so for example, for the staff repeater, we could set it to be either collapsed or hidden by default. And then we would only expand it once the data actually came in. The same goes for, let's say, the error message. We might decide to keep that collapsed or hidden and only display that error message if there actually is an error. And once we actually have our data, we would collapse the loader. That might have all gone over your head. It's a lot of talking and not a lot of doing. So let's hop in and see how this might actually look in a traditional demonstration. To get started, what I'm going to do is build the function which is going to populate the repeater with our data. So what I'm going to do over here is I'm going to create a new function, and I'll call this populate staff repeater. In this demonstration, I'm trying to create some kind of staff list or something that's displaying the different staff in our organization, for example. And what we're going to have here is we're going to have the onReady for the repeater. So let me select the repeater. I called it staff repeater. And I'm going to say on item ready. And here we're going to have $item and item data. If you're not so familiar with repeaters and how they're populated with data using code, I have several tutorials on the topic. It's something we talk about quite frequently on the channel, so I'd recommend you check those out. I'm going to assume some basic knowledge here of how repeaters work. And what we're going to do is we're going to assign the data from this mock data that we have over here to each of the items inside of the repeater. So for example, I'm going to select item, and then here we're going to have, let's say, staff name. And that text is going to be equal to item data dot name. Okay. And then we're going to have, let's say, item, we're going to have an image. So it's going to be staff. I named it staff image. And the source will be equal to the item data dot image, just like that. And right after we do that, what we're going to want to do is we're going to select our staff repeater, and we're going to assign it the data. So we'll say .data equals to staff. And typically this data would be data that we're getting from a data collection or some third-party server or something like that. But for demonstration purposes, I'm going to do a simulation here. So we're using this mock data as if it's already been fetched. And I'm going to implement a delay function in order to simulate that fetching of data is taking possibly a long time, possibly on a slower site. Before we implement that, though, I just wanted to show you that the data is populating the repeater. But before we do that, I just need to make sure that each of our staff here has a unique ID. And that's because repeaters require each item to have a unique ID like they might typically have inside of a Wix collection. So let me go ahead and add that in for each one of the items. So I'm just going to add here, let's say ID. And I'm actually just going to give it like really simple IDs like 1, 2, 3. And that should suffice for this. I'm pointing this out just because this is something that usually tends to be a little confusing if you're not familiar with how repeaters work. So let me just go ahead and put those IDs in right over there, 1, 2, 3. And that should be enough for us to display the data correctly in the repeater. The last thing we need to do is make sure to actually call our function. So I'm going to go over here and populate staff repeater. Awesome. Let's just make sure that the data is populating correctly. So I'm going to temporarily uncollapse this staff repeater. And let's go over here into preview mode and see if our data is showing. And let's take a look over here. So I don't see the data showing here yet. That's always fun. We have a little bug that means. Let me go back here to edit site and take a look and see what might not be going right here. Staff repeater.data equals to staff. So it's not really showing us any kind of errors in the developer console. So what I would do in this kind of situation is publish a test site in order to see if there are any console logs on the live site. So let's go ahead and do that. So we're heading now to the test site, and I'm just going to go ahead here and inspect. And let's go over here to console. And let's see over here, each item in the items array must have a member named ID, which contains a unique value identifying the item. So that's what I thought that I had set up. So if we go over here, I set up, okay, so I made a mistake. I did ID, I didn't do underscore ID. That was my bad. And that's probably why it wasn't working. And now if we head into preview mode, then I think that it should be fine. So let's preview again as a test site. And I purposely leave in these kind of small hiccups in our tutorials because I think it's important for learning purposes. And now you can see here that it's populating with the data. There are some design issues, but overall, it seems to be working. So now let's discuss how we would incorporate like a loading state along with an error message if there was an issue. The next thing we're going to do is to incorporate our different loading states and error state. So I'm going to go over here back into our code, and I'm going to create a new function which is going to be responsible for the entire flow. And it's going to be an asynchronous function, and I'll call it load repeater. And the primary thing that this is going to do is it's going to wrap the loading of the repeater inside of a try catch. So here what we're going to try and do is we're going to try and populate the staff repeater. And if we manage to populate the staff repeater successfully, Then what we'll do is we will collapse our loader. And we're going to expand our repeater. So staff repeater dot expand, just like that. And let's not forget to make our repeater collapsed by default. There we go. And here, inside of the error state, what we'll do is we will set the error message. So we'll say error message dot text should be equal to, let's say, error dot toString. Okay, typically you wouldn't want to actually display the system error to the user, but for now let's use that. And I'm also going to expand the error message. Dot expand. Now, for all this to be clear and visible, what we need to do is we need to introduce a slight delay to simulate the fetching of the data. And that's why we have this delay function over here. Okay, so this delay will essentially, we can pass in a certain amount of milliseconds, and it will delay the execution of the next thing by that amount of milliseconds. So I'm going to just call that delay right over here before we populate the staff repeater. So I'm just going to go over here and say await delay, and let's just delay it by 2 seconds. I don't want it to be too long. I don't want to bore you out. And the last thing that we're going to do is we're just going to switch out this populate staff repeater function for our new load repeater function, just like that. Okay, so let's try this out now. I'm going to go ahead and preview this as a test site. And let's see. So now we see the loading state only. Okay, so that makes sense. And then hopefully after 2 seconds pass, then we will see the actual repeater. I'm going to try refreshing it one more time just to make sure we're using the most updated version. There we go. So we see the loading state, and then we see the repeater. Okay, so that's what it's supposed to look like. And if I would increase the delay, you would have seen the loader for longer, and that is possible. It could happen depending on how complex the data fetching actually is. Next, what we're going to do is simulate the error state. And I'm going to do that by just throwing an error over here inside of the try. So here, let's say after the delay, instead of running populate staff repeater, what I'm going to do is I'm going to throw new error. And I'll just say this isn't working. And this basically is simulating a scenario where we're trying to, let's say, fetch our data, and that promise didn't resolve. It got rejected because server error, because some other problem, who knows. So let's go ahead and see what this might look like. So I'm just going to go ahead, and to avoid the issues that we've had with the test sites, I'm just going to actually publish this to a live site. Let's call this load state. And we can go ahead and just publish that. And that should make things a little more streamlined. Even though sometimes publishing to live, you need a few refreshes to make things start working. So I'm just going to go ahead and publish that. Let's view the site. And let's see. So we're going here into the loading state. And then you can see here, error, this isn't working. Okay, and we might have also chose to, let's say, hide the loader here or something like that. But that is the typical classical traditional way of managing these kinds of things within Wix. Another approach could be possibly usage of a multi-state box, but it generally is something along those lines. So now that we have a basic understanding of what the problem is, what we're trying to achieve, let's explore a new and cooler way that we might be able to handle these different loading states. For our new approach, I've made a few changes that you can probably see here. One is that you don't see the loader and the error state. The second is that this repeater is no longer collapsed. And thirdly, inside the code itself, I've really simplified it down to just our bare bones load repeater with a short delay. What we're going to be implementing today is a skeleton animation for our loading state. And we're going to be doing it by altering the elements themselves using some custom CSS. That's why we have to be using Wix Studio. To give you an idea of what we'll be doing, if you take a look at this code pen over here and the animation that you see here on the bottom, this is what I mean by a skeleton. It's kind of these shimmering blocks. That's a very common UI for displaying loading states in major applications these days. And here I already have the pre-written CSS that we're going to need for that. If you need this CSS, then you can hop over to the wixwiz.com and check out the blog. I'll make this code snippet available there. So let me just go ahead and copy this CSS from right over here. And then I'm going to head over here back to the editor. And I'm going to look for our global CSS, which is over here inside of the code panel, inside of page code. You can see here that we have the global CSS. And once that opens up, I can just paste this right in here. And that's all we're going to need to do in terms of the global CSS. You can make some adjustments if you want, like if you want to adjust the colors of the skeletons and whatnot. But this is pretty much all we're going to need in order to make this work. The next thing we're going to need to do is we're going to need to actually apply that skeleton class using code when we're in loading state, and when we're out of loading state, we're going to need to remove it. So let's go ahead and do that over here in our code for our home page. And the way we're going to do it is we're going to use these Velo methods. So for custom class list, what we can do is we can select an element, select this custom class list, and either add, or we can also remove and do a few other operations for different custom classes. So that means that before we start, when we want to start showing our skeleton, we can go ahead and we can add this class in. We could even set it to be that class by default. And then we're going to remove it once the loading is complete. So let's go over here and try this out. So I'm going to go over here into the editor. And what I'm going to do over here, inside of the try catch for the repeater, I'm going to select not our entire repeater, but I'm going to select the individual different elements inside of the repeater and apply the skeleton to each one. That's how I design my skeleton operation. The reason I did it like this is so that the skeleton actually kind of looks like the design of what the data is going to look like. And I think you'll understand a lot more what I mean once you actually see it working. So what I'm going to do over here is I'm going to select, for example, our staff image. And I'm going to say dot custom class list dot add. And we're going to add in our skeleton. I just have to remember how I spelled it. I want to make sure skeleton, just like that. And add in our skeleton class. And we're going to do the same thing for our for our name and for our button. Okay, so we have here staff name. And here we're going to have staff button. And this is a little sloppy initially. We could probably make this more efficient later on in terms of our code. This is staff, I think read more button I called it. Yeah. Okay. But for now, I'm just kind of writing it all out in kind of pasta code, and then we can make alterations and improve it later on. So here we added in the skeleton for all of them. And then what we're going to want to do here is after our delay and after we populate the staff repeater, what we're going to want to do is we're going to want to remove the skeletons. So I just copy pasted all that code, and I'm just going to switch these adds to remove. Just like that. And now I'm going to increase the delay slightly just so we can appreciate the skeleton, assuming it'll work. So let's make this 4 seconds. And what I'm going to do now is I'm going to publish the site to see if our skeleton state is working, or our loading state is working. So there we go. Our site's published. Let's go ahead and view that. So here you can see the skeleton. The shimmer doesn't seem to be working very well, but you saw that after 4 seconds, it loaded in the images. Let me go ahead and see why our shimmer wasn't working, possibly because I forgot to copy. Yeah. So I forgot to copy the shimmer part of the CSS over here. And I'm only human, so that can happen. So here we have the animation part, which I didn't copy. So it's right over here. So I'm just going to go ahead and put that back over here in the editor inside of our CSS. So again, it's just really copy paste. And then I'm going to republish the site just so that you can appreciate the shimmer. I think that's the cool part. A loading state should always have something that's moving. So there we go. So here we have the shimmer. And after 4 seconds, then our data is loaded in. So that's really awesome, I think. I think it's a much better experience than what we had before with like a separate loader. And it's also much easier to set up. There's no UI elements that you need to switch out. It's just using your original UI and applying some CSS via code, which we can definitely streamline. The next thing I want to discuss is how we can do something similar and have possibly an error state in addition to our loading state. What I've done for our error state is I've generated some new CSS, and this time this will be CSS that will apply to the repeater as a whole. So I'm just going to copy over this error class that we have over here. So let me just go ahead and grab that. And I'm going to go back to our editor and put it right over here under our skeleton. And here inside of our page code, what we're going to do is that if we have an error over here inside of the catch, what we're going to do is we're just going to apply that error class to our repeater. So let me go ahead and select the repeater. So staff repeater dot custom class list dot add, and here we're going to add error, just like that. And what I'll do is the same way that we did last time. I'm going to, after our delay, just throw a new error like that. Okay. And let's go ahead and see what this looks like on our live site. So we go over here. Let's go ahead to view site. And initially we see the loading skeleton because we don't really know there's an error yet initially. And then after that, we can see here that it just loads this error on top of it that says failed to load content. We might choose at this point again to remove the skeleton. We might choose to leave it. We could also probably do more complex things where maybe only part of the content loads. So some of them will show failed content. Some of them will actually show the elements. You could really dive in and do different layers of complexity here. But if you want to keep things simple, then it would be something along the lines of what I just showed you. One caveat to displaying the error messages in this way is that you have to choose the error message in advance. So you can't have a custom error message based on the reasoning, for example, that the content failed to load, because you need to set the content of this CSS, the content of the CSS in advance. You can see here that we hard-coded it here into the CSS. So if we go over here, you can see it says failed to load content. So this is something you'd have to program in advance. So that's one of the downsides to handling at least the error state through CSS. On the other hand, it's much more clean and you can pretty much just use that for your entire site if you're okay with having one or maybe two or three specific error messages and not displaying what the actual causes of the errors were each and every time, which is not something you always want to display to the end users. Sometimes it's just enough for them to know something went wrong and they should reach out. So that is how we would implement a skeleton. Again, if you would want, you could make this a little more efficient by creating possibly a new function that would add the skeleton to a few different elements in a loop and then remove them in a loop. I'm not going to dive into it now because there are really different permutations of how it can be done. And I think this is really enough for you to get the gist of it and implement something like this on your site. I hope you enjoyed this tutorial. If you did, don't forget to give it a thumbs up. And if you want to see more content like this every week, hit that subscribe button, and I will see you next time.